Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is an author and a painting artist. As an author, her novel is titled Tap Dancing at the Bluebird. In addition to her work as an author and artist, she runs the Read to Write books and SeeShape visual thinking ventures. Her name is Christine Walker, and my interview with Christine will follow the note-taking sounds. Christine Walker, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
My name is Christine Walker. I'm a visual artist and author. My most recent book it's a novel called Tap Dancing at the Bluebird, published by Sibylline Press. I'm also the author of a book called Painter's Garden, Cultivating the Creative Life, which was published by Warner Books, and of an illustrated children's book that I illustrated and co-wrote with my husband, who's a musician, and includes songs, a song CD, and it's called Woolly Cat's Musical Theater. It was published by Tortuga Press.
This interview is going to focus mainly on tap dancing at the Bluebird, but I am going to have a question about your other books as well. Later on in the interview. Without spoiling too much of Tap Dancing at the Bluebird, what is your novel about?
Well, the one-line pitch for the book, the one-line description, which every writer should have, by the way, at their ready, is an uplifting story of love, family, and friendship, celebrating dance and second chances across a century of change in America. So that kind of wraps it all up, and I can tell you more specifically without spoiling the story. It was inspired by my grandmother's diaries that she kept during the Great Depression. That's what got me started, and I invented the story from there. It takes place in 1932, 1960, and 2020, and it spans about 100 years in my main character's life. Her name's Maddie.
Okay. What was your inspiration for the main characters in your novel?
Well, Maddie Toff, my main character, who starts out at 12 in the book and lives to be 100 by the end of the book. She lives beyond that. But she actually was initially inspired by my aunt. So my father's family, my paternal grandmother's diaries got me going thinking about the Depression and what people went through. And my Aunt Mary Lou, very colorful person in my life who's no longer with us, but at the time I was writing the book, she had been the one who had transcribed my grandmother's diaries and by that I mean she had typed them from all the various notes and places where she'd found them. And so my grandmother was no longer living. And my aunt was a very colorful character in her own life and just a big-hearted, creative person. And so she had told me once about tap dancing as a young girl, and I kind of started it with her as an inspiration and my father's family as an inspiration. That inspiration of this really good-hearted, resilient family, very creative, who struggled during the Great Depression, lost their house, but made it through with a lot of love and generosity. That's really the heart of the book. And I veered away from my aunt as the character, really. I invented this character, Maddie, but those were some of the early inspirations. And then my tap dancing youth character who comes to Kansas City where Maddie is as a girl, and he's 15. That character sort of came out of just my imagination. And then later on, it became quite inspired by my son Quinn. And that was because as I was writing, I'd been working on the book for quite a long time, and actually my son died in 2020, and my character had been named Joe Wood, just a name out of nowhere, and I decided I could change the name to Kip Kelly, and I gave this character what I call quintessence, just a lot of his kinetic energy and spirit and brilliance, and found that was a really wonderful way for me to work through my grief and also to give him basically a long eternal life.
Now, would you classify your novel as historical fiction, or would you classify it in a different genre?
I classify it as historical literary fiction, and that is because it is historical. There's kind of a subgenre that's called 20th century fiction, so historical fiction. So it fits in that because it starts in 1932, and I did do a lot of historical research, and it's very much I had in mind very much to kind of bookend this particular time from 1932 to 2020. And but it also falls into the literary fiction because I'm a literary writer and reader, and so that in some there's other genres in terms of the marketing upmarket and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's not a thriller, it's not a mystery. It has love in it, but it doesn't fit the romance category.
How much research did you have to do on how people lived in Great Depression era middle America, or were you able to rely mostly or entirely on your grandmother's diary?
No, yeah, I did a lot of research. So I grew up in Kansas City. I was born there, and the diaries take place there, most of them, and the story begins there. So I had a working knowledge of Kansas City, but of course, not since then. And I was born in 1948. So I looked at old maps. I had at one point walked this neighborhood where the book is initially set. And I mean, even at one point, I had my aunt who lived in Hawaii at the time on the phone with me, and I was walking the neighborhood. There's a drive called Cliff Drive, and the cliff the area is above the railroad tracks, and the cliff is about a 10-story cliff. And I was just walking the neighborhood. She was pointing out where they had lived, the houses, the schools, that sort of thing. So I had and there's a lookout, and I used that lookout point, which overlooks the river, Missouri River in Kansas City. So I had this kind of working knowledge in my body of the distance. So for instance, when I have, Maddie going from her school down to the restaurant to work, I have a sense of walking to school, but also taking a streetcar down to downtown. And also if they walked home, it would take about an hour, that sort of thing. But I did look at Google Earth and that sort of thing to get a sense of it. But I, of course, had to look at old maps to get a sense of what the city looked like then, because it's changed a lot. I did have a lot of sort of texture for my grandmother's diaries in terms of how they lived, and they took in borders. My grandfather was an architect, and he was twice poet laureate of Kansas City of Kansas, and he had a lot of work published in the Kansas City Star. But he struggled a lot during the Great Depression because there wasn't much building going on. So they did start a restaurant, although they didn't start this restaurant till later in the 30s, and they also lost their house, and they didn't lose their house till later in the 30s, but I put it all happening in 1932. And in the book, the character Maddie does leave home because the family loses their home, and she takes off on it following Kip on the train. So I looked at train routes. This particular train route follows what became Route 66, but at the time there wasn't that highway. I looked at, food and what they wore. I looked at pictures online. I had some family photos and that sort of thing. But yeah, I did a lot of research, and even things like, this comes to mind, I was describing the restaurant. It's called the Bluebird Buffet, where Maddie meets Kip, and the family owns this restaurant. And she works there after school and on Saturdays. And I was describing it, and I kind of wanted it very shiny, sparkly, because there's a scene where he comes to the door the first time and everything's very sparkly. So I was thinking chrome bar stools with blue leather seats. And then I started thinking about it. I thought, well, when did chrome actually come into use? And I researched it. And so this story takes place in May and June of 1932 in this section. And chrome wasn't really widely used in things like furnishings at that point. It had been introduced, but even on the cars. So I did use the chrome in the chrome bumpers on the Cadillacs in the 1960s section. So when you think about our world, maybe in 1932, maybe it wasn't quite as shiny as the world that we have now. So little details like that really can make a difference when you're setting the scene. And the vocabulary that you use and that sort of thing. So, I love the research, and you have to be careful doing research. You can go down a lot of rabbit holes that are fascinating. However, you don't want to put all that research into your book because it can really stop the narrative. So you have to learn a lot of it and, absorb it, and then you have to kind of throw it out.
How long did it take you to write Tap Dancing at the Bluebird, and what were the easiest and hardest aspects of writing the novel for you?
Well, I began this novel in 2004. I was inspired by my grandmother's diaries, like I said, and I had done a free write in a writing group I was in. And that became the first chapter of this book, which started quite differently then, but there's the essence of it that I did retain. And I began, at that time, the little girl was 10, but I later made her 12. I wanted her just a little bit older in order to leave home. And very soon after that, within a few months, I went to start my MFA program at Bennington, at the Bennington Writing Seminars, which is a low residency program. And in that first workshop where I brought the chapter, my mentor teacher at that point had suggested that I don't work with historical material, that I work with my own life material. So I began a novel about motherhood, and that was my thesis novel. And the Tap Dancing at the Bluebird was actually the third novel that I had ever begun. Once my earlier book, Painter's Garden, came out, which was nonfiction, I wrote 2 novels, and was starting this third one, Tap Dancing, went to Bennington, and I finished the Bennington program in 2006. And so by then I had 3 finished novels, and I went back and began working on Tap Dancing at the Bluebird, also revising some of these other novels, also doing my other work, which I do out in the world. I do client consulting and strategic visualization and design. And so then, like I said, I continued working on it. And in 2016, it was important to my character, Maddie, because her mother and aunt had voted in the first election that women were allowed to vote in America, that the first woman president, Hillary Clinton, was elected. And so I have this scene in 2016 where Maddie's in a retirement village and she's watching Hillary be elected and, become the
that
first
didn't happen in real life.
Right. So thank you for reminding me. Yeah, no, you're right. And so what happened was I thought, well, I can't end it that way because I didn't want it to be a fantasy. I really wanted the history to be real and authentic as much as possible. As a writer, you can change dates and things somewhat, but I couldn't have changed something like that. So I actually put it aside for a little while, trying to figure out how to end the book. And I was working on it again, very intensely in January 2020, and my son died. And it was a huge tragedy in my life. And it took me a while to get back to the book, several months really. And that's the point where I changed the character Joe Wood to Kip Kelly. And I gave this character what I call quintessence, just a lot of my son's energy. And it enabled me I usually get up at 5 a.m. to write. So it enabled me to get up and be eager to enter this world of 1932, where he certainly had never lived and I had never lived, but he was no longer in my current life either. And it enabled me to just spend time with him. And so then I finished the novel. Really finished it again. It had been finished before, but with a quite different ending. And I, gave it to my editor in the summer of 2024, last summer. So you could say it took 20 years and a lot of my life in it, but certainly I wasn't writing on it all of that time.
Is Tap Dancing at the Bluebird independently, traditionally, or hybrid published?
It's traditionally published by a small press, Sibylline Press, which is a very interesting endeavor. We have quite a few authors and books now, and it was started by 4 women, all who have a lot of publishing experience. The publisher is Vicki D. Arman. It's traditional. It is small. It's got authors all over the country, so it's not just a local press. And I originally had met Vicki D. Arman I live in Northern California, and she was the marketing director of a wonderful local independent bookstore that has like 8 shops called Copperfield's Books. And she was the marketing director there. And I had gone to the store to talk with them about teaching writing classes, which I did. And I met Vicki and we became very good friends. We were writing buddies for a long time, exchanging our manuscripts back and forth. So she was very familiar with this manuscript. She started the publishing company, Sibylline Press, in I think the fall of 2022, and specifically for their mission is to publish the brilliant work of women authors over 50. So all of the authors who are published are women. They all are 50 years old or older. And it's a great group of people. We find that partnering together on events is very powerful, and we support each other. And but it is a traditional format.
You've written some other books without spoiling too much about them. What are they called and what are they about?
Well, A Painter's Garden, Cultivating the Creative Life, is it's got my paintings in it of the garden, of learning to garden and enjoying the garden, both in a small postage stamp size backyard in San Francisco and my property here in Sonoma County, which is about an acre of a lot of perennials in the field. And my painting studio is here. And I explore just what it is to be an artist, a writer, a mother, and a lot of that material was actually taken from journals that I've kept journals since college about creative process. And the inspiration for that came from a friend who gave me a rose bush. I went out to the garden to draw it. I started writing a letter to thank her, and I just knew I had a book. And the book was basically a conversation with friends in their creative lives. And I wrote some essays and I presented it to an agent, immediately got an agent. She sent it to a lot of the big publishers, we sent to 5 in particular that I sent a lot of visuals to, and we got 3 offers, and Warner ended up publishing it. And that was so there's no plot to ruin in this book. It's really about just reflections on creativity and exploration of what it's like. And I use the garden metaphor. So, planting and growing and detritus and that sort of thing, celebrating the bounty. And Willie Katz Musical Theater, my husband and I decided to write songs based on the nursery rhymes. And but we changed them. They're very positive. So Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall, but they call a baker and a doctor, and eventually they call his mother, and she says, "Pull yourself together, Humpty," and he does and jumps up. And so they're very lively and hopeful songs. And my husband's a musician and songwriter, Dennis Isom.
You have a couple of different ventures, and one of them is called Read to Write Books, and there's some workshops and online courses that one can find on the Read to Write Books website.
Yes.
How do those workshops and online courses work?
I did put up, I've taught a lot of workshops in person, and I will do that again, and I do some things on Zoom. But the online courses that I have, when you can go to that website, readtowritebooks.com, you can also go to ChristineWalkerAuthor.com, and it has access to the courses. And I have a YouTube channel with some mini courses. The online course is a full course in 9 parts, which I call 9 Ways to Mastery. And this is something that I developed after my MFA. My MFA program's motto was read 100 books, write one. And the meaning of that, of course, is that you learn from really masterful authors. And so as part of my MFA, and then I continue to do this, when I read a book that I think is terrific, or it is terrific in some way that I can really learn from, I'll write about it. And so the blog has some of that writing about, are we going to study point of view? How do you transfer consciousness if in an omniscient point of view, a close third person going back out to the omniscient, going back to a different close third person of a character. And so, for instance, Anne Patchett does that beautifully in Bel Canto, and so I studied that. Then in the coursework that I give, and I have this online course that's self-paced, so you can take that course and at your own speed. And then so I go, the basic 9 parts are gatekeepers and story seeds, voice, style, and point of view, whole body characters, sense of place, tension and plot, time and consciousness, love and other emotions, image and the senses, and theme and gestalt. And the idea is that you can enter your story at any point. You might enter it from your inspiration of the idea itself, or you might enter it from an overheard conversation that you think, wow, that's kind of an interesting story, or it might come from a sense of place, or it might come from just being overwhelmed by a certain emotion or sense or character. And then as you're writing and drafting and revising, you work back and forth across this wheel that I created. It's a visual tool. And it just kind of helps you, especially with novels. There's so much to keep going in your mind. I liken it to having a bunch of balloons floating over your head. You've got your characters, you've got your place, you've got your story and your plot elements, and then your little details. And at any given time, you need to kind of pull down one balloon and focus on it, because that's all you can do. You write one word at a time. And but how do you keep them all, nearby? I find when I'm deep into writing a novel, I'm walking in my life, I'm talking to people, but all the time that novel is going on in my head. So this approach, this 9 Ways to Mastery approach that I've created really helps me, and I think it's helped other people construct a novel, work on it, find the motivation. And it works for stories too. It works for memoir. It even works for nonfiction, because any good writing has most of these elements working all the time.
Another venture of yours is called SeeShape Visual Thinking. How does SeeShape work, and what services are available through it?
Okay. So this is something that I do, where I go out and I work with generally groups of people, corporations, nonprofit organizations. It could be a board of directors. It could be a certain kind of team for team building. It can be a strategy for the whole organization, or part of an organization, long-range planning, mission building. I do it also sometimes for large conferences. And I basically draw the visual story. I draw what's being said, but I use words and images, a lot of metaphor. So I can graphic record, which means I am recording this visually on huge paper, 4 by 8 feet, often larger. I've done things 17 feet long. And I also facilitate. So I can also lead the discussion and help people, that phrase of getting everyone on the same page. This is a really great tool for doing that. And it helps people find the commonality for their agreement and disagreement. It helps them explore with this sort of yes and approach, and really come to some new ways of perceiving problems and issues, and looking at long range planning, and helping get their mission messaged. There's just a lot of wonderful uses for it. I also work individually. I work with a lot of artists individually, whether they're trying to, understand what their book is about, or whether they're branding their own books and teaching and courses that they give. So that comes from a left brain, right brain thing. I can draw and I can write, and so I use both of those things. And when I'm running a session, I'm just sort of a conduit. I'm listening and I'm translating through my body and my mind what's being said in such a way that visually it lands on the page. And it may be a metaphor such as a journey, that's a typical one, or climbing a mountain and with a destination, or maybe more it could be a volcano. It could be, there's any number of things that could come out of images from the discussions. So it's a very dynamic, very interesting thing to do. There are people doing this all over the world. I belong to an organization called the International Forum of Visual Practitioners, IFVP. It's still a little rarefied, just because, I do know visual artists who have tried it and they don't listen in the same way. And I know writers, of course, who tried it and they don't draw. You don't have to be a great drawer to do it, but you certainly have to have a visual sense of space.
One final question: as an artist, what types of paintings do you paint?
My current work is abstract, and I call them Comings and Goings and Joy and Light. And these are paintings that I've also began doing after my son passed away. And they're really about exploring. They're meditations on love and memory and hope and resilience. And they're colorful, they're full of shapes, they're dancing. I love dance. And and we didn't talk about my dance, a little bit of a dance background. We can get to that if you'd like to.
Go ahead. We've got a couple minutes.
Okay. And but before that, I also had painted these paintings of the garden. So my work has evolved over the years from representational work of swimmers, pedestrians, gardens to this current work, which is based more in aerial landscape. I would just talk about the dance. I love dance. Dance has a terrific benefits for health and longevity. There's a lot of studies that show that dancing helps prevent or delay dementia. It's just good for you in so many ways. And it's not that I think of myself as a good dancer, but I did study dance and choreography with the ODC San Francisco. And then I began designing sets and costumes with them. So I spent a lot of time between about 1980 and 94 watching dance rehearsals and studying how the dancers moved and how they developed material. I also took tap dancing. There was a little dance troupe performance at the Embarcadero one day. But I used some of what I knew about tap dancing to build the scenes in tap dancing at the Bluebird. I also watched YouTube and learned from that. I didn't remember everything, what steps were called. And then in terms of the section of 1960 in the book has contemporary modern dance in New York. So I used a lot of my experience in working with dancers for that. And then it also has social dancing in the 2020s. And I have studied salsa, and my husband and I like to go line dancing. So dance is a big part of my life.
Christine, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest to interview.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
This podcast is mainly about books, writing, and literature, and it always will be, but I loved learning about visual thinking from Christine. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.